The massive German Shepherd collapsed on Maple Street, the tumor consuming half his noble face like a grotesque mask of suffering. Dorothy Mae Sullivan dropped her morning coffee, the ceramic mug shattering against her porch steps as she witnessed what everyone else had chosen to ignore for months. This wasn't just any stray dog. The faded canine unit collar, barely visible beneath matted fur, told a different story entirely. Mrs. Henderson from across the street gasped audibly, her newspaper falling from trembling hands as she finally saw what Dorothy had been watching unfold in slow motion. The mailman, Jerry, stopped mid-stride, his face draining of color as the reality hit him. Children on bikes skidded to horrified stops, their laughter dying in the crisp October air. Dorothy's mind flashed to her late husband's Purple Heart, gathering dust in the drawer while this war hero suffered alone. The irony cut through her like a blade, another forgotten soldier, abandoned by the country he'd served. "Dear God," she whispered, her arthritic hands gripping the porch railing. How long has he been fighting this battle by himself? How could an entire neighborhood turn blind to such magnificent courage wrapped in such devastating pain? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dorothy Mae Sullivan had been invisible for exactly 17 months. She knew because she'd started counting the days since her daughter-in-law Rebecca had declared her too much of a burden and stopped bringing the grandchildren around. At 75, with arthritis gnawing at her joints and a Social Security check that barely covered the basics, Dorothy had become what she'd never imagined possible, a ghost in her own neighborhood. The modest ranch house on Maple Street had once buzzed with life. Robert's booming laugh had filled these rooms for 37 years before Vietnam claimed him in 1968. Their son Michael had brought his own family here for Sunday dinners until Afghanistan took him too in 2009. Now, the silence pressed against Dorothy's chest like a physical weight, broken only by the tick of Robert's old army clock and the distant sound of children she was no longer allowed to see. Every morning at 7 sharp, Dorothy positioned herself on the front porch with her coffee and a dignity that refused to bend despite everything life had thrown at her. She'd served 3 tours as an Army nurse, had held dying soldiers while bombs fell around her, had raised a son alone after losing her husband. If she could survive all that, she could certainly survive being forgotten by her own family. The neighborhood had changed around her. Young families moved in with their perfect lives and polite smiles that never quite reached their eyes when they looked at the old woman who collected coupons and talked to herself. They saw her as a relic from another time, someone to pity rather than respect. What they didn't see was the Purple Heart citation hanging beside her nursing credentials or the thank you letters from soldiers whose lives she'd saved. Dorothy's routine had become her anchor. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon soap operas, evening news that reminded her the world kept spinning without her. She'd catch glimpses of Rebecca dropping off the grandchildren at school sometimes, little Emma and Tommy growing taller each month while Dorothy remained a stranger to their lives. Rebecca's words still echoed. "You're too set in your ways, Dorothy. The children need modern influences, not outdated ideas about duty and sacrifice." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd dedicated her life to caring for others, wounded soldiers, her dying husband, her grieving son, only to find herself alone when she needed care most. Her monthly medications cost more than she had left after rent and utilities, forcing her to choose between heart pills and heating bills. Pride kept her from asking for help, the same pride that had carried her through war zones and hospital wards. But even invisible people notice things. From her porch perch, Dorothy had watched the German Shepherd's slow deterioration over the past 6 months. The magnificent animal had appeared one day, majestic despite his obvious illness, and had been struggling to survive ever since. While everyone else crossed the street to avoid him, Dorothy recognized something familiar in his eyes. the look of a soldier who refused to surrender even when the battle seemed lost. The morning of September 15th started like any other, with Dorothy shuffling to her kitchen at dawn to brew the single cup of coffee that had become her daily luxury. But as she pushed open the back door to retrieve yesterday's forgotten dish towel from the line, she found him collapsed against her garden shed like a fallen monument to suffering. The German shepherd lay on his side, his massive frame rising and falling with labored breaths that misted in the cool morning air. The tumor had grown since she'd last seen him from her porch, a grotesque mass that had completely consumed the left side of his noble face, distorting his features into something that would make children scream and adults look away in disgust. Yet, even in his broken state, there was something unmistakably regal about the way he held himself, as if dignity were coded into his very DNA. Dorothy's hands trembled as she knelt beside him, her arthritic knees protesting against the cold concrete. Up close, she could see the evidence of his battle, not just against the cancer, but against a world that had clearly failed him. His ribs showed through matted fur that had once been golden brown, and old scars crisscrossed his back in patterns that spoke of deliberate cruelty. But it was his eyes that broke her heart completely. The right eye, still visible and unobscured by the tumor, held an intelligence so profound it took her breath away. Here was a soul that understood suffering, that had known betrayal, yet somehow still trusted enough to collapse in her backyard rather than die alone in the woods. "Oh, sweetheart," Dorothy whispered, her voice catching as she gently touched his unaffected ear. "What have they done to you?" The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, barely a flutter, but enough to confirm what Dorothy had suspected. Beneath the disease and neglect, beneath the horrific disfigurement that made him look like something from a nightmare, this was still very much a dog who remembered kindness. More than that, as Dorothy's fingers found the faded collar hidden beneath matted fur, she realized this was a dog who had once served with honor. The small metal tag was scratched and worn, but she could still make out the essential information. K-9 Officer Max, Unit 47, Oklahoma City Police Department. Below that, in smaller text that made her heart skip, Medal of Valor recipient, April 19, 1995. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. April 19, 1995. The Oklahoma City bombing. She remembered watching the coverage, remembered the heroic dogs who had searched through rubble for survivors, while aftershocks threatened to bring down what remained of the federal building. This wasn't just any abandoned animal. This was a certified hero, a dog who had risked his life to save others, now dying alone and forgotten in a suburban backyard. The irony hit her like a physical blow. Here they both were, two forgotten veterans, two souls who had served their country with everything they had, now cast aside by the very society they'd sacrificed to protect. The parallel was so stark it made her dizzy. Or maybe that was just her blood pressure medication wearing off again. Max lifted his head slightly, his good eye focusing on Dorothy's face with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into her soul. In that moment, she saw herself reflected back. Not the invisible old woman the world saw, but the nurse who had never lost a patient without a fight, the mother who had raised a son to be honorable, the wife who had honored her husband's memory for 57 years. Max saw her not as a burden or a relic, but as someone who might understand what it meant to keep fighting when everyone else had given up. Dorothy's grocery money sat in her purse, $43 that was supposed to last until her next Social Security check arrived in 2 weeks. The smart thing, the responsible thing, would be to call animal control and let them handle it. Rebecca would certainly approve of that choice. The practical voice in her head, the one that sounded increasingly like her daughter-in-law, whispered about fixed incomes and realistic expectations and the foolishness of old women who anthropomorphized strays. But Dorothy Mae Sullivan hadn't survived 3 wars by listening to practical voices. She'd survived by listening to the voice that told her some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible, especially then. "Come on, soldier," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Let's get you some help." Max's tail wagged again, stronger this time, and Dorothy knew she'd made the only choice she could live with. As she reached for her phone to call the veterinarian, she felt something she hadn't experienced in nearly 2 years. The electric thrill of being needed, of having a mission that mattered more than her own comfort or safety. Neither of them knew that across town, Officer James Jameson was already making phone calls about his missing canine partner, or that this moment of compassion was about to unleash consequences that would transform not just their lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it meant to honor those who serve. Dr. Sarah Chen had seen plenty of heartbreaking cases in her 15 years as a veterinarian, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of Dorothy Sullivan gently coaxing a disfigured German shepherd from the back of Jerry Martinez's pickup truck. The mailman had volunteered to drive them when Dorothy's 1997 Honda wouldn't start. And now all 3 humans stood in the parking lot of Millfield Animal Hospital, staring at what looked like a living nightmare. The tumor had grown beyond anything Dr. Chen had encountered in textbooks. It consumed the left side of Max's face entirely, a mottled mass of diseased tissue that had pushed his eye closed and distorted his jaw to the point where eating must have been agony. Yet the dog moved with careful dignity, allowing Dorothy to guide him toward the clinic entrance without pulling or resistance. His remaining visible eye tracked Dr. Chen's movements with an intelligence that made her chest tighten. Here was a mind trapped in a body that was failing catastrophically. "How long has he been like this?" Dr. Chen asked as they settled Max onto the examination table, her professional composure cracking slightly at the scope of neglect before her. "I'm not sure," Dorothy replied, her weathered hands never leaving Max's unaffected side. "He appeared in the neighborhood about 6 months ago, but the tumor, it's been growing the whole time. Nobody wanted to get close enough to help." Dr. Chen's initial examination revealed the true horror of Max's condition. The tumor wasn't just large, it was actively spreading, pressing against vital structures that controlled breathing and swallowing. Without immediate intervention, the dog had perhaps 2 weeks left to live. But as she ran her hands along his body, checking for additional masses, she felt something that stopped her cold. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said slowly, her fingers tracing a series of small, parallel scars along Max's ribs. "These aren't from the cancer. These look like impact marks. Old ones. Someone has been hitting this dog with something metal repeatedly over a long period of time." Dorothy's face went white. What kind of monster would beat a sick animal? But Dr. Chen was studying the faded collar she'd removed, squinting at the worn metal tag. Suddenly her eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God! Mrs. Sullivan, do you know who this is? This is Max, the K-9 officer from Oklahoma City. He was on the news. He saved those children when the school bus crashed into the river 5 years ago. He's a certified hero." The revelation hit Dorothy like a physical blow. This magnificent creature, this living medal of honor, had been wandering her neighborhood for months while she watched from her porch like a passive observer. She thought of all the times she'd seen him searching through garbage cans, limping past her house in obvious pain, while she sat in her comfortable chair and did nothing. "The Oklahoma City bombing anniversary coverage last year," Dr. Chen continued, her voice filled with awe and horror. "They did a feature on him. Max was one of the K-9 units who worked the rubble for 72 hours straight, finding survivors. He located 12 people, including a 3-year-old girl who was trapped for 18 hours. The mayor gave him a medal." Dorothy's mind reeled. A hero. A genuine American hero, reduced to this. How does someone like that end up abandoned and sick? Dr. Chen's expression darkened as she continued her examination. The abuse patterns I'm seeing, this wasn't random cruelty. Someone who knew how to hurt an animal systematically did this. Someone who had regular access to him. She paused, her professional mask slipping. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to ask, can you afford treatment? Because what this dog needs, it's going to be expensive. Very expensive. The number hit Dorothy like a sledgehammer. $8,000 minimum, potentially more if the cancer had spread to other organs. Her entire savings account contained exactly $237. Her monthly Social Security check was $847, most of which went to rent, utilities, and her own medications that she'd already been rationing to make ends meet. Dorothy started, then stopped. She looked down at Max, whose good eye was fixed on her face with an expression of patient trust that nearly broke her resolve. He wasn't asking for miracles. He wasn't demanding anything. He was simply trusting her to make the right choice, whatever that might be. Dr. Chen's voice softened. Mrs. Sullivan, I can see how much you care about him, but I have to be honest with you. Even with treatment, there's no guarantee. Transmissible venereal tumors like this are aggressive. The chemotherapy is brutal. He might not survive it, and even if he does, the reconstruction surgery alone could cost another $5,000. Dorothy's fingers found the simple gold wedding band she'd worn for 57 years, never removing it even after Robert's death. It wasn't worth much. They'd been young and poor when they married, but it was all she had left of tangible value. What if we start treatment and see how he responds? Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Chen said gently, I can't in good conscience take money from someone on a fixed income for what might be a lost cause. This dog is suffering. Maybe the kindest thing— No. The word came out sharper than Dorothy intended. Doctor, I've been a nurse longer than you've been alive. I've seen hopeless cases recover and sure things fail. But I've never seen anything survive without someone willing to fight for it. She straightened her spine, channeling the authority she'd wielded in Army field hospitals. This dog has been fighting alone for months. The least I can do is fight alongside him. Max's tail moved slightly against the examination table, as if he understood every word. Dr. Chen looked between the determined elderly woman and the dying hero dog, recognizing something she'd rarely seen in her practice, the kind of bond that transcended logic and entered the realm of the sacred. All right, she said finally. But, Mrs. Sullivan, you need to understand what you're signing up for. This isn't just about money. If we do this, if we really commit to saving him, it's going to be a long, difficult road. Are you prepared for that? Dorothy's answer came without hesitation, spoken with the quiet conviction of someone who had already lost everything that mattered and finally found something worth saving. Doctor, I haven't had a purpose in 2 years. Maybe it's time I remembered what I'm made of. The first chemotherapy session nearly broke Dorothy's resolve. Max lay on the steel examination table like a fallen warrior, his magnificent frame reduced to trembling vulnerability as Dr. Chen administered the toxic cocktail that might save his life or accelerate his death. The tumor had responded poorly to the initial treatment, actually swelling larger for the first week, pressing against his windpipe until every breath became a conscious effort. Dorothy spent those 7 nights sleeping on the floor beside his makeshift bed in her living room, listening to his labored breathing and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Maybe Rebecca's right, she whispered to Max during one of those endless midnight vigils, her arthritic fingers gently stroking the unmarked side of his face. Maybe I am just a foolish old woman throwing away money we don't have. But Max's good eye would find hers in the darkness, holding her gaze with such profound trust that the doubts would dissolve. And he wasn't giving up. Neither would she. By October 1st, something shifted. The tumor's angry red color began to fade to a duller pink, and Max started accepting small amounts of water without immediately vomiting. Dr. Chen cautiously mentioned that the swelling seemed to have stabilized, though she warned against too much optimism. TVT is unpredictable, she explained during their third visit. Sometimes it responds beautifully to chemotherapy, sometimes it fights back harder than we expect. The financial reality hit Dorothy like a sledgehammer when she opened her October bills. The first chemotherapy session had cost $1,200, money she'd borrowed against her November Social Security check. Her prescription medication sat unfilled at the pharmacy because she couldn't afford the $200 copay. She'd been rationing her heart medication, taking pills every other day instead of daily, telling herself it would be fine until Max was stable. The community's reaction surprised her with its intensity and division. Word had spread about the elderly woman spending her life savings on a dying dog, and opinions split along generational lines with surgical precision. The older residents, particularly fellow veterans from the American Legion Post, rallied around Dorothy with quiet determination. They understood the code. You don't abandon a fellow soldier, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. But the younger family saw it differently. At the grocery store, Dorothy overheard Susan Walsh telling another mother, "It's heartbreaking, really, but that money could pay for a year of groceries." At her age, she should be thinking practically. The judgment in their voices stung worse than Dorothy expected. She'd survived sniper fire and mortar attacks, but suburban disapproval felt like a different kind of warfare. The tension came to a head during the second week of October when Rebecca arrived unannounced, her BMW idling in Dorothy's driveway like an expensive threat. She swept into the house with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as facts, taking in Max's condition with barely concealed disgust. "Mom, this has gone far enough," Rebecca announced, her designer heels clicking against Dorothy's worn linoleum. "I've been talking to elder care specialists. There's a lovely facility in Columbus that accepts Medicaid. You could have your own room, 3 meals a day, proper medical supervision. No more worrying about bills or—" She gestured vaguely at Max, who had retreated to the corner but kept his protective gaze fixed on Dorothy. "No more freedom, you mean," Dorothy replied quietly. "No more choices. No more purpose." "Purpose?" Rebecca's laugh had sharp edges. "Mom, your purpose now should be taking care of yourself. This obsession with a dying animal is not healthy. The children ask about you, but how can I explain that Grandma chose a dog over her own family?" The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Dorothy felt the familiar tightness in her chest, partly her heart condition, partly the rage she'd been swallowing for 2 years. "I didn't choose anything over family, Rebecca. You made that choice when you decided I wasn't good enough to be around my own grandchildren." "That's not," Rebecca started, but Dorothy held up a trembling hand. "I held dying soldiers in Korea when I was younger than you are now. I raised your husband when his own mother couldn't be bothered. I've never, not once, failed to show up when someone needed me. But somehow, when I need something, when I need to feel useful, to have something depend on me, suddenly, I'm the problem." Max slowly rose from his corner, moving with deliberate care to position himself between Dorothy and Rebecca. Despite his illness, despite the tumor that made him look monstrous, his body language was unmistakably protective. He didn't growl or show aggression. He simply stood as a gentle but implacable barrier, his message clear. No one would hurt this woman while he drew breath. Rebecca stepped back instinctively, her composure cracking for the first time. "Mom, that animal could be dangerous. Look at him. He's deformed. What if he snaps? What if he attacks the neighbor's children?" "He was a police dog, Rebecca. He saved lives. The only dangerous thing here is your inability to see past appearances." Dorothy's voice carried the authority she'd once wielded in trauma wards, commanding respect from doctors twice her age. "This dog has more honor in his damaged body than most people have in their whole lives." That night, after Rebecca left with threats about taking legal action if necessary, Dorothy sat on her living room floor beside Max's bed, counting and recounting her remaining money. $43 in her purse, $57 in her checking account. The mortgage payment was due in 10 days, and she was already 2 months behind on her property taxes. The math was simple and devastating. She could either continue Max's treatment or keep her house, but not both. Max seemed to sense her distress. With tremendous effort, he lifted his massive head and rested it gently on her lap, the weight both comforting and heartbreaking. His good eye looked up at her with such profound understanding that Dorothy felt something crack open in her chest, not her heart condition, but something deeper. The wall she'd built around her emotions since Michael's death began to crumble. "I don't know how to save us both," she whispered into his fur, tears falling freely for the first time since the funeral. "I'm just one tired old woman with more bills than sense." But even as she spoke the words, Dorothy felt a familiar stirring. The same feeling she'd had when facing impossible medical cases in field hospitals, when the smart money said to give up, but something deeper said to keep fighting. She'd saved lives with less resources and longer odds. The question wasn't whether she could save Max. The question was whether she was still the woman who had never backed down from a fight that mattered. Outside, the first frost of autumn painted her windows with delicate ice crystals, and Dorothy made a decision that would either destroy them both or prove that miracles still happened to those brave enough to believe in them. The turning point came on a gray November morning when Officer James Jameson appeared at Dorothy's front door, his uniform crisp and his smile practiced in that particular way cops used when they needed something. He was younger than Dorothy had expected, maybe 50, with the kind of military bearing that would have impressed her in different circumstances. But Max's reaction told a different story entirely. The moment Jameson's shadow fell across the threshold, Max transformed. The gentle, trusting dog who had been Dorothy's constant companion for 6 weeks suddenly pressed himself against the far wall, his entire body trembling with a terror so profound it made Dorothy's blood run cold. The good eye that had looked at her with such love now darted frantically between Jameson and the back door, as if calculating escape routes from a predator he recognized all too well. "Well, I'll be damned," Jameson said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine relief. "There's my old partner. We've been looking everywhere for him. Haven't we, Max?" He extended his hand toward the dog, and Max actually whimpered, a sound so heartbreaking and un-German shepherd-like that Dorothy instinctively stepped between them. "He's been with me for over a month," Dorothy said carefully, watching Max's continued distress. "I found him collapsed in my backyard. He was dying." "Yeah, Max has always been dramatic about his health," Jameson chuckled, but his eyes remained hard. "Cancer's rough on the old boys, but he's tougher than he looks. Always was a fighter, weren't you, buddy?" Again he reached toward Max, and again the dog pressed himself further into the corner, his tail tucked so tightly it nearly disappeared beneath his body. Dorothy had seen enough trauma in her nursing career to recognize the signs. This wasn't a dog greeting his beloved partner. This was a victim in the presence of his abuser. "Officer Jameson, I'm not sure Max is ready to—" "Look, ma'am, I appreciate what you've done," Jameson interrupted, his tone shifting to something more authoritative. "But Max is department property. Technically, he should have been retired to my custody when his service ended. There's paperwork and everything. I can show you the documentation if needed." The transformation in the room was electric. Max, despite his weakness, managed to position himself protectively in front of Dorothy, his massive frame creating a barrier between her and Jameson. Even dying, even disfigured by disease, his protective instincts overrode his terror. He would face his abuser to protect the woman who had shown him kindness. Dr. Chen had been listening from the examination room doorway, and she stepped forward with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of advocating for animals who couldn't speak for themselves. "Officer Jameson, I've been treating Max for 6 weeks now. In my professional opinion, removing him from Mrs. Sullivan's care at this point could be detrimental to his recovery. The stress alone might trigger a setback." Jameson's friendly facade cracked slightly. "Doc, I appreciate your concern, but this is a police matter now. Max was reported missing from my property. I've been worried sick about him." "Missing from your property?" Dorothy repeated slowly, her nurse's training kicking in as she processed inconsistencies in his story. "Officer, if Max has been missing for months, why wasn't there a search? Why no missing dog posters? In my experience, when someone loves an animal, they move heaven and earth to find them." The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Jameson's jaw tightened, and for just a moment Dorothy saw something flicker across his face, not concern for a beloved pet, but the calculating look of someone whose cover story was being questioned by a sharper mind than he'd anticipated. "Mrs. Sullivan, with all due respect, you don't understand the complexities of handling retired K-9 units. There are protocols, procedures. Max was being transitioned to civilian life gradually. Sometimes these dogs, they wander. It's part of the adjustment process." But Dr. Chen had been studying Max throughout the conversation, and her veterinary eye caught details that Jameson clearly hoped would go unnoticed. "Officer, these injury patterns I'm seeing, they're consistent with systematic abuse over an extended period. Multiple broken ribs that healed incorrectly, dental damage from blunt force trauma, burn scars along his back legs. This dog has been tortured." The word hung between them like an accusation. Jameson's face flushed red, and Dorothy saw his hands clench into fists, the same hands that had apparently brutalized the hero dog now cowering behind her legs. "That's a serious allegation, Doctor. You might want to be careful about making unfounded accusations against a police officer." "I'm not making accusations," Dr. Chen replied evenly. "I'm stating medical facts. This dog shows classic signs of long-term physical abuse. As a veterinarian, I'm legally obligated to report suspected animal cruelty to the authorities." "I am the authorities," Jameson snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. "And I'm telling you that dog belongs to me. I have the paperwork to prove it." Dorothy felt something ignite in her chest, not her heart condition, but the same fire that had carried her through Army field hospitals when colonels tried to intimidate her into compromising patient care. She'd faced down officers before, and she'd be damned if she'd let this one terrorize a sick animal on her watch. "Then show me the paperwork," she said, her voice carrying the steel that had once made grown soldiers stop arguing and start following orders. "Because until I see legal documentation proving ownership, Max stays right here where he's been getting the care he deserves." Jameson's expression turned ugly. "Ma'am, you're interfering with police business. I could have you arrested for theft of department property." "Good," Dorothy replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. "Please call your supervisor. I'd love to explain to them how their department property ended up with cancer and broken ribs in my backyard, while his supposed caretaker never reported him missing." The standoff stretched between them like a wire under tension. Max remained pressed against Dorothy's legs, his body language screaming terror despite his obvious weakness. Dr. Chen stood ready to intervene, her phone already in her hand. And Dorothy, all 5 feet 3 inches of her, faced down a man half her age and twice her size with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose except her integrity. Jameson seemed to realize he was outnumbered by 2 women who weren't going to be intimidated. "This isn't over," he said finally. "That dog is coming home with me, one way or another. I'll be back with the proper documentation." After he left, the clinic fell silent except for Max's gradually steadying breathing. Dorothy's hands shook as adrenaline faded, leaving her feeling every one of her 75 years. But when she looked down at Max, she saw something that made her heart soar. For the first time since Jameson's arrival, the dog's tail was wagging. Not much, just a gentle rhythm against the floor, but enough to confirm what Dorothy already knew in her bones. "You're safe now, soldier," she whispered, kneeling beside him, despite the protest from her knees. "I don't know how we're going to fight this battle, but we're going to fight it together." Dr. Chen watched the interaction with growing amazement. In her years of practice, she'd rarely seen such an immediate and profound bond between human and animal. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think you should know, Max's response to treatment has been remarkable since he's been with you. The tumor has shrunk 15% in 6 weeks. That's almost unheard of for TVT cases this advanced." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. "He's a fighter. Always has been, from what I can tell." "There's something else," Dr. Chen continued carefully. "I've been researching Max's history since Officer Jameson's visit. His service record is exemplary, multiple commendations, perfect health reports through 2019. Then, nothing. No medical records, no retirement documentation, no transfer paperwork. It's like he simply disappeared from official records 3 years ago." The implications settled over Dorothy like a cold blanket. "You're saying Jameson took him off the books?" "I'm saying someone did. And Mrs. Sullivan, dogs don't develop stress fractures in their ribs from normal retirement activities. They don't get burn scars from living peaceful civilian lives. Whatever happened to Max after his official service ended, it wasn't the hero's retirement he deserved." That evening, Dorothy made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 months earlier. She opened the cedar chest that held Robert's most precious possessions. His Purple Heart, his Bronze Star, his dress uniform with sergeant's stripes still perfectly aligned. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, lay her own military decorations. 3 bronze stars for valor in the field, a combat medical badge, and a letter of commendation from General Westmoreland himself, praising her courage under fire. She'd never displayed these honors, had never spoken of them to her children or grandchildren. The war had been something to survive and move past, not something to glorify. But looking at them now, holding the weight of recognition for service and sacrifice, Dorothy felt a strength she'd thought was lost forever. She wasn't just a lonely old woman burning through her savings on a lost cause. She was a decorated veteran making a tactical decision to save a fellow soldier. The next morning brought visitors. First came Harold Peterson from the American Legion, his own Purple Heart pinned to his worn jacket, carrying a coffee can filled with crumpled bills. "Dorothy, the boys took up a collection. It's not much, about $400, but we wanted you to know you're not fighting this alone." Then came Martha Williams from the church auxiliary, her arms full of casseroles and her eyes bright with purpose. "Honey, we've organized a bake sale for this weekend. That dog's story has touched a lot of hearts. People want to help." But the most surprising visitor was Tommy Chen, Dr. Sarah's teenage son, who knocked softly and asked if he could walk Max in the afternoons. "My mom told me what he did in Oklahoma City," the boy explained. "I wrote a report about him for school. He's like a real superhero. I just want to help." As October progressed, Dorothy watched Max slowly emerge from his shell of trauma and pain. The tumor continued to shrink, revealing more of his noble features each week. But more importantly, his personality began to shine through. He would bring Dorothy her slippers each morning, somehow knowing that her arthritis made bending difficult. When she had trouble opening pill bottles, he would nudge them closer with his nose, as if offering assistance. And every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, he would position himself by the front door, watching for threats with the alertness of a trained protector. The breakthrough came during Max's 5th chemotherapy session when Dr. Chen made an observation that changed everything. "Mrs. Sullivan, look at this." She showed Dorothy the latest X-rays, pointing to areas where the tumor had been. "The bone structure underneath is completely intact. No invasion into the jaw or skull. It's almost as if something was protecting the vital areas while the cancer grew." "What does that mean?" "It means Max's body was fighting this cancer from the beginning. His immune system was trying to contain it, to keep it from spreading to areas that would kill him quickly. That level of biological determination, I've only seen it in animals who have something powerful to live for." Dorothy understood. Max had been holding on, waiting for something worth surviving for, just like she had been. The real test came on Halloween night, when a group of teenagers, emboldened by darkness and stupidity, decided to egg the crazy old lady's house with the monster dog. Dorothy heard them coming, 6 kids with toilet paper and malicious intent, thinking they were targeting an easy victim. What they didn't expect was Max. The transformation was instantaneous and magnificent. The sick, beaten dog vanished, replaced by every inch the canine officer he'd once been. Max positioned himself on Dorothy's front porch, his posture perfect despite the tumor, his good eye tracking each movement with tactical precision. He didn't bark or show aggression. He simply stood there, 65 pounds of trained authority, radiating the kind of controlled power that made smart people reconsider their choices. The teenagers took one look at him and scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Dorothy watched from her window, feeling pride swell in her chest. "That's my boy," she whispered. "Show them what a real hero looks like." But the incident had an unexpected consequence, Mrs. Patterson from next door, who had been among Max's harshest critics, called the police to report a vicious dog threatening neighborhood children. The responding officer was friendly enough, but his report would become ammunition for Jameson's return, and this time he wouldn't be asking nicely. The call came 3 days later. Jameson's voice was cold, professional, stripped of any pretense of friendliness. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm coming by tomorrow morning with the proper documentation. Max is coming home where he belongs. And ma'am, I'd strongly advise against making this difficult. Interfering with the return of police property is a felony." Dorothy hung up the phone with hands that shook only slightly. She looked down at Max, who was watching her with that profound intelligence that never failed to amaze her. "Well, soldier," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Looks like we're about to face our biggest battle yet." Max's tail wagged once, deliberately, and Dorothy knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. She hadn't felt this alive, this purposeful, since the day she'd held her son for the last time. Some battles were worth fighting, even when you couldn't see how you'd possibly win. The foreclosure notice arrived on the same morning as Jameson's promised return, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who couldn't meet Dorothy's eyes as he handed her the official document. 60 days to vacate the premises or face eviction. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Sullivans, that had been Robert's dream and Michael's inheritance, was slipping away like water through her arthritic fingers. Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, the notice spread before her next to Max's latest medical bills, trying to make sense of numbers that refused to add up. $8,000 for chemotherapy, $1,200 for the upcoming reconstructive surgery, $3,000 in overdue mortgage payments. Against that mathematical mountain stood her remaining resources, $17 in her checking account and a wedding ring that might fetch $200 at the pawn shop downtown. Max lay beside her chair, his head resting on her feet in the way that had become their morning ritual. The tumor had shrunk to half its original size, revealing the magnificent bone structure of his face, but the treatment had taken its toll on his body. He'd lost 15 pounds, his coat had thinned, and the chemotherapy left him nauseous for days after each session. Yet every morning he would bring Dorothy her slippers, somehow knowing that her arthritis made bending impossible on cold November days. The knock on the door came at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual as military precision demanded. Through the peephole, Dorothy saw not just Jameson, but a younger officer and a woman in a business suit who screamed legal authority from her polished shoes to her briefcase. Max had already retreated to the back bedroom, his survival instincts overriding his protective nature when faced with the source of his trauma. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jameson said, as she opened the door, his voice carrying the false patience of someone who expected compliance. "This is Officer Martinez and legal representative Jennifer Walsh from the city attorney's office. We're here to retrieve department property that was improperly retained." Jennifer Walsh stepped forward with a folder thick enough to choke a horse. "Ma'am, I understand you've grown attached to the animal, but K-9 Officer Max belongs to the Millfield Police Department. We have documentation dating back to 2018 showing continuous ownership and registration." Dorothy's nursing training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but 40 years of marriage to a military man had taught her to spot bureaucratic bullshit from a mile away. "Continuous ownership. Officer Jameson, when exactly did you report Max missing? Because I've been caring for him for 6 weeks, and this is the first I'm hearing about any search efforts." The question hit its mark. Jameson's jaw tightened, and Dorothy caught the barely perceptible glance he exchanged with Walsh. "Mrs. Sullivan, the circumstances of Max's departure are complicated. Sometimes retired K-9 units need time to adjust. We were monitoring the situation." "Monitoring?" Dorothy's voice rose despite her efforts to stay controlled. "You were monitoring a cancer-stricken dog wandering the streets? A dog with broken ribs and burn scars that didn't come from any tumor?" Officer Martinez shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this level of pushback from a 75-year-old woman. "Ma'am, if you have concerns about animal welfare, there are proper channels." "I'm looking at improper channels right now," Dorothy interrupted, her military bearing asserting itself in a way that made all 3 visitors step back slightly. "A decorated war hero, reduced to scavenging garbage while his supposed caretaker monitors from a distance. In my day, we called that dereliction of duty." From the back bedroom came a sound that froze everyone in place. Max was crying. Not whimpering or whining, but producing the deep, mournful wails that German shepherds make when their hearts are breaking. The sound was so human, so profoundly tragic, that even Walsh's professional composure cracked slightly. "Jesus," Martinez whispered under his breath, then quickly covered with a cough when Jameson shot him a warning look. Dorothy felt her own heart breaking in response to Max's distress. Here was a dog who had saved lives, who had served with honor, reduced to cowering in a back bedroom while bureaucrats decided his fate like he was a piece of equipment to be transferred between departments. The injustice of it burned in her chest worse than any heart palpitation. "He's terrified," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Officer Jameson, that dog is terrified of you specifically. In 50 years of working with trauma victims, I've learned to recognize the signs. Max isn't just scared. He's reliving abuse every time he looks at you." Jameson's facade finally crumbled completely. "Listen, lady, I don't know what you think you know, but that dog has behavioral issues. He's aggressive, unpredictable. The department was planning to put him down before he went missing. I'm actually doing you a favor by taking him off your hands." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Walsh's eyes widened in horror, and Dorothy realized that even the city's legal representative hadn't been told the full truth about why they were here. This wasn't about retrieving valuable department property. This was about covering up a crime. "Put him down?" Dorothy's voice carried the ice-cold fury she'd once reserved for incompetent doctors who endangered her patients. "You were planning to murder a Medal of Valor recipient because he had behavioral issues that you caused?" "That's not—" Jameson started, but Dorothy wasn't finished. "Do you know what I see when I look at Max, officer? I see a dog who brings me my medication when I forget it, who positions himself between me and the door when strangers visit, who hasn't shown one moment of aggression despite being in constant pain. The only behavioral issue I've witnessed is his terror when you walk into the room." Martinez was now staring at his partner with growing unease. "Jim, what is she talking about? You said the dog was lost during a training exercise." The web of lies was unraveling faster than Jameson could weave new ones. Dorothy pressed her advantage with the tactical instincts that had once saved lives under enemy fire. "Officer Martinez, have you seen Max's medical records? The X-rays showing multiple healed fractures, the documentation of burn scars and blunt force trauma, because Dr. Chen has been very thorough in her treatment notes." Walsh was now frantically taking notes, her expression shifting from bureaucratic efficiency to something approaching alarm. "Officer Jameson, were you aware of the animal's medical condition prior to today's visit?" "The dog was injured in the line of duty," Jameson said quickly, but his voice had lost all authority. "Canine work is dangerous. Animals get hurt." "For 3 years straight?" Dorothy asked. "Because that's how long the abuse patterns suggest this has been going on. 3 years of systematic torture of a war hero." The truth hung between them like a sword ready to fall. Dorothy could see Jameson calculating his options, see Walsh realizing she'd been used to provide legal cover for something that was rapidly revealing itself as criminal. Martinez looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Then came the sound that changed everything, a car door slamming outside, followed by Rebecca's voice, sharp with authority. "Mother, I saw the police cars. What's going on here?" Dorothy's heart sank as her daughter-in-law swept into the house like an avenging angel of practicality, taking in the scene with the rapid assessment of someone accustomed to taking charge. This was exactly what Dorothy had feared, Rebecca arriving to handle the situation by removing all the complications from Dorothy's life, including Max. "Officers, I'm Rebecca Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan's daughter-in-law and medical power of attorney," she announced with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "If this is about the dog, I can resolve this immediately. My mother-in-law is not competent to make decisions about expensive veterinary care or harboring potentially dangerous animals." The betrayal cut deeper than any of Jameson's threats. Dorothy felt her world collapsing from 2 directions at once, the man who had tortured Max closing in from one side, and her own family preparing to surrender him from the other. She was losing the battle before it had even truly begun. But then she heard something that stopped her heart, the sound of Max's claws clicking deliberately across the hardwood floor. Despite his terror, despite his weakness, he was coming out of hiding. Not to face Jameson, but to stand beside Dorothy in her moment of crisis. The dying dog positioned himself between Dorothy and everyone else in the room, his body language clearly protective despite the trembling that betrayed his fear. Even Walsh seemed moved by the display of loyalty, while Martinez stared in obvious amazement at the courage of an animal choosing to confront his abuser rather than let his protector face the threat alone. "Look at him," Dorothy said softly, her voice breaking with pride and heartbreak. "Look at what real courage looks like." And in that moment, with her house being foreclosed, her family ready to commit her, and the authorities preparing to hand Max back to his torturer, Dorothy Mae Sullivan made a decision that would either destroy them both or prove that some bonds transcend law, money, and the cruelty of those who mistake power for righteousness. The truth began to unravel when Tommy Chen burst through Dorothy's front door without knocking, his teenage face flushed with excitement and righteous anger. In his hands, he clutched a manila folder thick with printouts and a laptop displaying what looked like official police documents. "Mrs. Sullivan, you need to see this," he panted, completely ignoring the shocked faces of Jameson, Walsh, Martinez, and Rebecca. "I've been researching Max's service record for my senior project, and there's something really wrong with Officer Jameson's story." Jameson's face went white. "Son, you need to leave. This is official police business." "No, this is my business too," Tommy shot back with the fearless conviction of youth. "Max is a hero, and heroes don't deserve to be lied about." He opened his laptop, turning the screen toward the assembled group. "Look at this. Official K-9 retirement records from the Oklahoma City Police Department. Max was never transferred to Millfield PD. He was retired to a civilian adoption program in 2019, and guess who signed the adoption papers?" The document on the screen showed a signature Dorothy recognized, not Jameson's, but that of an elderly man named Frank Morrison, age 73, listed as a veteran seeking a companion animal. "Frank Morrison died in a car accident in January 2022, Tommy continued, his voice gaining strength. "His neighbor reported that his adopted German Shepherd disappeared the same day. The neighbor filed a missing animal report, but it was never investigated." Walsh was frantically taking notes, her professional composure cracking as she realized she'd been used to legitimize what was essentially theft. "Officer Jameson, can you explain these discrepancies in your account?" But Jameson was staring at Tommy's laptop with the expression of a man watching his life implode in real time. There must be some mistake in the records." "Sometimes paperwork gets mixed up between departments." "Not this paperwork," said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Chen standing there with a grim expression and her own folder of documents. "I've been in contact with the Oklahoma City Veterinary Unit that handled Max's medical care during his service years. They were very interested to learn that Max was supposedly alive and in police custody, especially since they have death certificate dated March 2022 signed by you, Officer Jameson, claiming Max died of natural causes and was cremated." The silence in Dorothy's living room was deafening. Jameson had officially reported Max dead while keeping him alive for torture. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. This wasn't just animal abuse, it was fraud, falsification of official documents, and theft of a decorated service animal. "Furthermore, Dr. Chen continued, her voice carrying the cold precision of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. "I've been in contact with other veterinarians in surrounding counties. 3 other retired K-9 units under Officer Jameson's care have died under suspicious circumstances in the past 4 years. All showed similar injury patterns to Max. All were officially reported as natural deaths with immediate cremation." Martinez was now staring at his partner with undisguised horror. "Jim, what the hell is she talking about? You told me Max was a recent transfer." Rebecca, for once in her life, was speechless. Her carefully controlled world of legal documents and proper procedures was colliding with a reality too ugly to process cleanly. Dorothy watched her daughter-in-law's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning horror as she realized the magnitude of what she'd almost enabled. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come. Tommy Chen, emboldened by the adult's shocked silence, pulled up another document on his laptop. "There's more. I found this in the Oklahoma City Police Archives. A commendation letter for K-9 Officer Max, dated April 15, 2001. He didn't just save people in the bombing, he found evidence that led to arrests in 3 other cases. He was supposed to get a full ceremonial retirement with honors." Dorothy's hands trembled as she read the letter aloud. K-9 Officer Max, demonstrated exceptional valor and intelligence in locating survivors and evidence in the aftermath of the April 19, 1995 bombing. His actions directly resulted in saving 12 lives and providing crucial evidence for federal prosecution. Officer Max exemplifies the highest standards of police service and deserves recognition as a true American hero. The words hung in the air like an indictment of everything that had happened since. Here was a dog who had served his country with distinction, who had earned a peaceful retirement filled with respect and care, reduced to dying slowly under the hands of the very institution he'd served. Jameson's last desperate gambit was as ugly as Dorothy had expected. You people don't understand the pressures of handling animals with PTSD. Sometimes they become aggressive, dangerous. I was trying to rehabilitate him, help him adjust. The injuries were from training accidents, self-harm from anxiety. It's not uncommon in retired K-9 units. Dr. Chen's response was swift and merciless. Officer Jameson, burn marks from cigarettes are not training accidents. Deliberate fractures in specific rib locations are not self-harm. I've documented 17 separate injury patterns consistent with systematic abuse over a 3-year period. And the most damning evidence of all, Max shows no aggression toward anyone except you. His behavioral problems are specifically triggered by your presence. As if summoned by the conversation, Max appeared in the doorway of the living room. But this wasn't the cowering victim Jameson had expected to see. 6 weeks of love, proper nutrition, and medical care had begun to restore not just his physical health, but his essential dignity. The tumor was now small enough that both eyes were visible, and those eyes, bright with intelligence and unwavering in their focus, fixed on Jameson with the steady gaze of a trained police officer who had finally found backup. Dorothy rose from her chair with careful dignity, her hand resting on Max's head as he moved to stand beside her. Officer Jameson, you're absolutely right about one thing. Max does have behavioral problems around you, but they're not aggression. They're the appropriate response of a torture victim to his torturer. The accusation hit the room like a physical blow. Walsh was already on her phone, clearly calling for additional legal support. Martinez had his hand near his radio as if preparing to call for backup against his own partner. Even Rebecca seemed to grasp the enormity of what was unfolding in her mother-in-law's modest living room. But Jameson wasn't finished. With the desperate cunning of a cornered predator, he played his final card. Mrs. Sullivan, you're clearly an animal lover, and I respect that. But you're also facing foreclosure, aren't you? I've done my research. This house will be sold at auction within 60 days. Where exactly do you plan to take Max then? The county shelter? Because I can tell you right now, they'll put him down the moment they see that tumor. The truth of it hit Dorothy like a physical blow. Even if she kept Max away from Jameson, even if she proved the abuse, she still couldn't afford to keep him. The foreclosure would separate them anyway, and Max would end up either euthanized or returned to the system that had already failed him once. However, Jameson continued, sensing her moment of weakness, I'm prepared to be generous. Sign over custody to me today, and I'll make sure the department covers any outstanding veterinary bills. Max gets the medical care he needs, and you don't have to worry about expenses you can't afford. Everyone wins. Dorothy felt the trap closing around her. Jameson was offering to pay Max's bills in exchange for legal custody, knowing full well that she couldn't afford to refuse. It was elegant in its cruelty. Use her love for Max against her, force her to choose between his immediate medical needs and his long-term safety. Rebecca, reading the financial reality with her characteristic bluntness, stepped forward. Mother, that's actually a reasonable solution. You've done your good deed, but you can't save every stray animal in Ohio. Officer Jameson is offering to take responsibility for ongoing care costs. That's more than generous. But, as Rebecca spoke, Dorothy noticed something that everyone else had missed. Max wasn't looking at Jameson anymore. He was looking at the manila folder Tommy Chen had brought, his nose twitching with sudden interest. His body language had shifted from protective alertness to something else entirely, the focused attention of a working dog who had detected something important. "Tommy," Dorothy said quietly, trusting an instinct she couldn't name, "what else is in that folder?" The teenager looked confused but flipped through the pages again. "Just service records, commendation letters, adoption paperwork, and this weird thing I found in the Oklahoma City archives, a evidence inventory from one of Max's cases. Something about a missing evidence cache that was never recovered." Max's ears perked forward at the word evidence, and he moved toward Tommy with more energy than Dorothy had seen from him in weeks. His nose touched the folder and he looked back at Dorothy with an expression so human it took her breath away, as if he was trying to tell her something crucial about the papers. Dorothy's mind, sharpened by decades of emergency medicine, began connecting dots that created a picture too enormous to fully grasp. Max hadn't just found evidence in his cases, he had hidden evidence. And if Jameson had been abusing him specifically, torturing him systematically, it might not have been simple cruelty. It might have been interrogation. The realization hit her like lightning. Jameson wasn't here to retrieve a beloved canine partner. He was here to silence a witness who knew where something valuable was buried. "Officer Jameson," Dorothy said quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had just solved a puzzle that changed everything, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what Max really knows." The look of pure panic that flashed across Jameson's face told Dorothy everything she needed to know. This wasn't about ownership or proper channels or veterinary bills. This was about secrets buried deep enough to drive a man to torture a hero dog for 3 years and valuable enough to forge documents and risk everything to keep hidden. Max moved closer to Dorothy, his body language shifting from defensive to something she could only describe as purposeful. Whatever he'd been protecting all these months, whatever knowledge had cost him so much pain, he was finally ready to share it with someone he trusted. The battle for Max's life was about to become something much larger, a fight for justice that would either destroy Dorothy's last hopes for a peaceful old age or transform her from invisible victim to avenging angel. 3 months later, Dorothy Sullivan sat in her back garden watching Max play fetch with her grandson Tommy, while little Emma braided wildflowers into chains for his collar. The German Shepherd's face had healed completely, revealing the noble features that had been hidden beneath months of suffering. Where the tumor had once dominated his profile, only a small scar remained, a badge of survival that somehow made him more beautiful, not less. The transformation had been miraculous, but not in the way Dorothy had originally imagined. The real miracle hadn't been medical but human, the way an entire community had rallied around the truth once it finally came to light. The evidence cache Max had led them to in Riverside Park contained documentation of police corruption spanning 15 years, implicating not just Jameson, but a network of officers who had been selling confiscated drugs and weapons back to the streets. The $75,000 reward for information leading to arrests had legally belonged to Max as the discovering K-9 officer, and therefore to his legal guardian. Dorothy's mortgage was now paid in full, with enough left over to establish the Dorothy and Max Foundation for elderly citizens and rescue animals. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd thought she was saving a dying dog and ended up exposing the biggest police corruption scandal in Ohio's history. Max hadn't just been a victim, he'd been a key witness whose torture had been designed to prevent him from revealing what he knew. Rebecca sat across from them now, her designer clothes replaced by jeans and an expression of quiet humility that had taken weeks to develop. The revelation that her mother-in-law was not a senile old woman, but a sharp-minded veteran who had single-handedly brought down a criminal conspiracy had forced Rebecca to confront her own prejudices about aging and worth. "Mom," Rebecca said quietly, using the title Dorothy hadn't heard in 2 years, "I owe you an apology that's about 17 months overdue. I was so focused on protecting you from making mistakes that I never stopped to consider you might be the one with wisdom worth protecting." Dorothy smiled, her attention partly on Rebecca but mostly on Max, who was demonstrating his fully recovered athleticism by leaping to catch a tennis ball mid-air. "Honey, you were trying to do right by me. Sometimes we just have different ideas about what right looks like." The legal proceedings had been swift once the evidence emerged. Jameson faced 15 felony charges, including animal cruelty, falsification of police documents, theft of evidence, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. The other officers in his network had fallen like dominoes, each trying to cut deals by providing testimony against the others. Martinez, who had genuinely known nothing about the corruption, had been cleared and promoted to detective, spending much of his free time helping Dorothy navigate the legal complexities of Max's reward money. Dr. Chen appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a fresh batch of medical records and wearing the satisfied expression of a veterinarian whose most challenging case had exceeded all expectations. "His latest blood work is perfect," she announced, settling into one of Dorothy's patio chairs. "No trace of cancer cells, liver function completely normal, kidney function excellent for a dog his age. In my professional opinion, Max is healthier now than he's been in years." "And mentally?" Dorothy asked, though she could already see the answer in Max's playful interaction with the children. "Remarkable recovery. Dogs are incredibly resilient when they're removed from trauma situations and placed in stable, loving environments. The nightmares seem to have stopped. He's regained his confidence and his protective instincts have returned to normal parameters, alert but not hypervigilant." Dorothy nodded, remembering the weeks when Max would wake up whimpering, his legs moving as if he were trying to run from invisible threats. Now he slept peacefully beside her bed, occasionally snoring with the contentment of a dog who knew he was safe and loved. The story had indeed gone viral, but not in the way any of them had expected. National news outlets had picked up the tale of the elderly veteran who exposed police corruption while saving a hero dog, and the response had been overwhelming. Donations poured in from across the country, some for Max's continued care, others for the foundation Dorothy had reluctantly agreed to establish. The irony wasn't lost on her that at 75 she'd become more famous than she'd ever wanted to be. "There's something else, Doctor," Chen said, her voice taking on the tone doctors used for especially good news. "The Association of Police K-9 Officers wants to present Max with their Lifetime Achievement Award next month. Apparently, his case has led to policy changes in how retired K-9 units are tracked and protected. He's going to be the poster dog for reform." Emma looked up from her flower chain, her 6-year-old mind processing this information with typical directness. "Grandma Dorothy, does that mean Max is famous now?" "I think we all are, sweetheart," Dorothy replied, still adjusting to the reality that her quiet life had been permanently altered. The foundation office took up her former dining room, staffed by volunteers who helped match elderly citizens with rescue animals in need of homes. The program had already placed 37 animals with waiting lists in 6 states. But the most profound change was in Dorothy herself. The invisible woman who had counted days of silence had become a force of nature that politicians and police administrators called for advice. She testified before the state legislature about animal welfare reform, consulted with the Attorney General's office on police accountability measures, and somehow found herself fielding interview requests from news outlets across the country. "I keep thinking about alternate timelines," Dorothy mused, As Max returned the tennis ball to Tommy and settled at her feet with the satisfied exhaustion of a dog who had played hard and well. What if I hadn't looked out my back door that morning? What if I'd listened to Rebecca about being practical? What if I'd been too scared to challenge Jameson? But you did look, Rebecca said softly, her own transformation evident in the way she now spoke to her mother-in-law, with respect rather than condescension. And Max knew it. Dogs can sense good people, Mom. He came to your yard because somehow he knew you were the one person who wouldn't give up on him. The truth of that observation settled over Dorothy like a warm blanket. Max hadn't collapsed in her backyard randomly. He'd chosen her, recognized something in the lonely woman on the porch that told him she was his last hope for justice and healing. The bond between them had been forged not just by her kindness, but by their shared understanding of what it meant to serve with honor and be forgotten by those they'd protected. As the afternoon sun painted long shadows across her garden, Dorothy reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The foreclosure notice that had once seemed like her final defeat now sat framed on her mantel, marked "Paid in Full" in red ink. A reminder that sometimes what looks like an ending is actually a beginning. Her empty bank account had been transformed into a foundation with significant funding. Her silence had been replaced by a voice that legislators and activists sought out for guidance. But the greatest transformation was sitting beside her. No longer the dying dog she'd found, but a fully restored German shepherd whose intelligence and courage had always been there, waiting for someone to see past the surface damage to the hero underneath. Max's recovery had become a symbol of resilience that inspired others. But for Dorothy, he remained what he'd always been, the companion who had given her life meaning again. The children's laughter filled the garden as Max performed the tricks he'd once used in police demonstrations, his movements fluid and powerful, no trace remaining of the broken animal who had once cowered in corners. Emma clapped as he sat perfectly at attention, his posture military straight, while Tommy documented everything with his phone for the Foundation's social media accounts. "You know what the best part is?" Dorothy said to Dr. Chen as they watched the impromptu training session. "I spent 2 years feeling useless, like my time was over. Turns out I was just waiting for the right mission. And Max was waiting for the right commanding officer," Dr. Chen replied with a smile. "You two were meant to find each other." As evening approached and Rebecca gathered the children for their drive home, Dorothy felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, foundation business, legislative meetings, and the ongoing work of matching senior citizens with rescue animals. But tonight, she was simply a woman in her garden with her dog, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. Max settled beside her chair as the last visitors departed, his head resting on her feet in their familiar ritual. The Medal of Valor that had been returned to him now hung beside Dorothy's own military citations in the hallway, 2 sets of honors that finally meant something again because they were witnessed by someone who understood their value. "We did good, soldier," Dorothy whispered, her fingers finding the sweet spot behind his ears that always made him sigh with contentment. "We saved each other." Max's tail wagged once, slowly, and Dorothy knew that whatever time they had left together would be measured not in months or years, but in moments of purpose, connection, and the kind of love that transcended species and circumstance. They were both exactly where they belonged, 2 old warriors who had found their way home to each other at last. Dorothy's story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be unwritten, even when the world tells us our time has passed. At 75, she thought she was invisible, just another forgotten senior counting Social Security dollars and watching life happen to other people. But when she found Max dying in her backyard, everything changed. She didn't just save a hero dog. She discovered that her experience, her compassion, and her refusal to give up were exactly what the world needed. The woman everyone dismissed as too old became the force that exposed corruption, saved lives, and built a foundation that continues helping others. Max wasn't the only one who needed rescuing. Dorothy needed to remember she still had fight left in her, still had wisdom worth sharing, still had love that could change lives. Their bond proves that age is just a number when you have purpose, and that sometimes our most meaningful relationships come when we least expect them. Every senior who feels overlooked, every person who thinks their best days are behind them, needs to hear this. Your next chapter might be your greatest one yet. What moment in your life made you feel most needed and purposeful? Have you ever found unexpected friendship or purpose when you thought it was too late? Share your story in the comments. Your experience might inspire someone else who needs to remember their own strength.